Yeah. As soon as they're mic'd. Are we all set?
I think so.
Okay. Okay. All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Just two quick administrative items. Just a reminder of the surveys that have been passed out. If you could please complete those. The second reminder is that we have in the back, is you probably have seen, a bookstore that has available all the books of the various journalists and speakers who are represented here today. And then third, we already have dates for next summer's Aspen Security Forum, July 24 to July 27, 2013. So please put that down on your calendar. And with that, if we close the doors, we're going to start. Well, as you know, the media has been interwoven throughout the course of the program, with every session being moderated by a nationally noted print or broadcast journalist. But in this session, we're going to focus discreetly and exclusively on the media's role in national security. To moderate the discussion, we're very pleased to have a representative of one of our sponsors, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, Clark Bell. Clark is the McCormick Foundation's Journalism Program Director. He joined the foundation in October 2005. He oversees $6 million in annual journalism grant-making initiatives, and he shapes the program's focus on critical issues facing the news media, like national security. He's a veteran reporter, editor, columnist, and communications consultant. His extensive journalistic background includes serving as a business columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, executive business editor of the Dallas Times-Herald, consumer affairs editor for the Chicago Daily News, etc. And I'm going to introduce the panelists as well. We're very pleased to have Paula Broadwell, who's the author of the new book, All In, The Education of General David Petraeus. Rajiv Chandrasekaran, who is the senior correspondent of the Washington Post and author of Little America, The War Within the War for Afghanistan. Mike Isikoff, who's a national investigative correspondent for NBC News. And Josh Meyer, the author of The Hunt for KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, is also a lecturer and director of education and outreach, the National Security Journalism Initiative at Northwestern University. Clark, over to you.
Thank you, Clark. Two Clarks in the same room. You know, after working with 10 military media conferences, the Center for Media and Security, defense writers groups, 2 academic programs at Northwestern University of Kansas, I've come up with the conclusion that there should be a healthy tension between the media and the subjects they cover. And this is probably especially true of the military, law enforcement, and security agencies. What we try to avoid is an unhealthy mistrust. And that's a challenge, but in the end, all sides are working for the same boss, the American public. We're into the final day of this thorough analysis of the state of Homeland Security and counterterrorism. It's been an enlightening program, but I must admit sometimes I get caught up in the data, the acronyms, and the well-nuanced analysis. This being our last day in Colorado, I suggest we throw some red meat on the fire. This is a sophisticated audience that seems fascinated yet puzzled by the art and science of journalism. And this is the one opportunity for a panel of journalists to answer questions rather than ask them. I think that's kind of refreshing, a little challenging for those of us who are in journalism. At Aspen, it is said that people really rarely move outside the box. In fact, those who are attending are the box. What we're going to try to do is to help you and help us understand how we can move that box. We were suggested to tackle the following theory. The media has a delicate balancing act to play in, on one hand, sensitizing the public to the gravity of the terror threat, and on the other hand, not doing the terrorist work by scaring the public to death. How are they doing? Well, as a panel, we talked about it. Half of us started yawning. The other half wanted to jump on a soapbox. I thought, let's go back and look at some of the stuff that's been said at this conference about journalism starting with Admiral McRaven on Wednesday night when he talked about leaks, classified intelligence, a greedy, highly competitive news media that grinds out stories that the public doesn't really need to know about, that threaten lives and can scuttle missions. But what about the public's right to know? Admiral McRaven was also asked about the cost and value of defense spending when it came to the two wars. And he said, is there value here? And he said, I don't know. You'll have to ask the American public. Well, how are we supposed to judge national security as journalists? Is it through the frame, as one of the speakers said 2 days ago, of the foul shooter who must make 85% of his foul shots to stay in the league? Or is it through the lens of a 300 hitter when 3 out of the 10 times you're right, you're in the All-Star game? So how are we going to make these decisions about access, accountability, and the free flow of information? I've asked the panelists to try to humanize this process by describing the moral, ethical, legal, and professional challenges that drive their work and their jobs. Speaking of access, I'd like to ask Paula to start off with. Here's someone who had virtually unlimited access to probably the best-known warrior of our times, General Petraeus. How did this access affect both your reporting and the final product?
Oh, thank you, Clark. That's a great question. And thanks to the Aspen Institute for putting together this wonderful group. It's a privilege to be here. As you mentioned, I was embedded with General Petraeus in Afghanistan, and it was a little confusing for some of the folks there because I'm also a military reservist with a top secret SCI clearance and then some. So a lot of my former peers didn't know how to treat me. Was I Major Broadwell or was I Journalist Broadwell? I had to follow very clear lines of non-disclosure and sign non-disclosure agreements like my colleagues. I felt like I was almost held to a higher level of accountability because I could lose my clearance. Yet I was entrusted with this opportunity to sit in on high-level meetings with General Petraeus, sit in on the SCIF meetings in the morning, listen to classified chatter of terrorist talk, and so forth. And I had that background anyhow, so I knew a lot of that information, and I think it was important to inform my writing, but I knew there was a clear line that I couldn't cross when I was writing it out. So I find it challenging sometimes to justify, or when we had this discussion last night, you feel like the government is holding something back or not giving a full truth or giving a false information. And I think that sometimes, obviously, the government just can't disclose information because of sources and methods and so forth. So that was just reinforced when I had access to everything. It was my responsibility not to leak it, not to violate my mentor, if you will. I was writing about a very close mentor. So
well, after going through this process, do you consider yourself a journalist?
No, I was going to mention that. I don't consider myself a journalist, and I'll play devil's advocate here today, taking on the government side of why we need to protect our sources and methods.
Well, the three distinguished gentlemen definitely are journalists. They're hard-bitten. They have great experience. They've done hard news. They've done feature stories. They've done books. Rajiv, new book out. Also had an earlier book about Emerald City and the rebuilding of Iraq. Types of reporting you do, how do you approach them differently between news, big takeouts, and then books?
Well, fundamentally different processes, but they're all complementary. The Afghan book that I've written builds upon more than a dozen reporting trips that I made out there for the Post starting in 2009. And each of those trips involved contemporaneous journalism. I was reporting stories out and publishing them near real time in the paper, but also accumulating material in my notebooks for future use. And a fair bit of what I was accumulating would be considered classified material. And I had to take great care. For instance, as I came to learn of the details of upcoming operations, there were certain things that didn't seem fit to print in the next day's Washington Post for obvious reasons, but were important in understanding the broader context of the mission and how it was unfolding. And it was under it was with that rationale that officers, that commanders were willing to share with me some of that information, and they did so at some degree of risk. But there is a bond of trust that I believe can be built between journalists and their sources, between journalists and those in various positions in government. And that sharing of information ultimately helps lead to better coverage and a better informed citizenry, though that material has to be handled responsibly. And you guys out there may think I'm being woefully naive in saying this, but I do believe that the vast majority of my colleagues that engage in serious work in covering national security matters, whether in the homeland or overseas, in our overseas military efforts, treat sensitive material that they are privy to with treat it with the utmost of care, and do not seek to compromise future missions, seek to put lives at risk, and that material is largely gleaned to broaden perspective, and so that helped me inform the narrative of the book. And obviously, for much of that material, there's a degree of perishability to it. So, what is sensitive today is far less sensitive, or not at all sensitive, a month or two from now, when said mission is over. And so, I engage in that balancing act, and I recognize there are people out there that take a very absolutist view on this, and I'm of the view that we would not be an informed public if those of us who are doing this sort of work were not privy to some of that material and then not handling it carefully.
Great. I'm going to skip Josh for a minute. Mike is one of really my heroes in the business, both the long-form stuff he's done, the great work at Newsweek, now, of course, working for NBC News. How do you approach, I want two questions. First, how do you approach things differently, television versus print? But more important, let's go back, let's then reel it in. How do you feel that the media is dealing with this balancing act of getting stuff out there without frightening and scaring people to death?
Well, first on the difference between television and print, I was describing this to a friend just the other day, and saying to get a investigative story on TV, you got to have something to show. You got to have video. You got to have somebody on camera. And I think of all the great investigative stories that have been done in recent years. I'm thinking of, just to pick one example, Dana Priest and the CIA black site prisons, and how I could ever have possibly gotten a story like that on the air if I didn't have video of the prisons to show. And my friend, my friend said it sort of sounds like third grade show and tell to do investigative story on network TV. But that aside, we find ways to do it. But I want to, completely associate myself with what Rajiv said about, first of all, the care that all serious journalists who work in national security take on when we learn things that are potentially or actually classified, when we learn national security secrets. And there's always the concern, would publication jeopardize something ongoing that might jeopardize lives? But the balancing test that we use is something different than that in government, and that is, does the public have a right to know this? Should the public know this? Does this inform the public debate? And I just think of all the big stories that have been done in the last 10 years since 9/11, in which in every case, from warrantless wiretapping to enhanced interrogation techniques to CIA black site prisons, all of these stories were denounced at the time as being horribly injurious to national security, that they were going to jeopardize ongoing operations, and in fact informed the public debate, led to major changes in the law. How much better are we now? I think most people would say that, for instance, in surveillance, that we have a surveillance law that puts wiretapping under the supervision of some sort of judicial authority, as opposed to how it was being done before that. Are we better off without that, as opposed to before we had that. And I think that in almost every case, you can make the case that the disclosure of classified information made substantial contributions to American democracy and to the American debate. And if the people who are really concerned about the disclosure of classified information would, instead of making comments like Admiral McCraven made the other day, do something really substantial and make a real contribution by attacking what everybody says is the major problem here, which is the overclassification of information. Every commission, every study has said this going back to 50 years. And yet, we don't see any real change on that. We don't see any real push for the people who care about national security to really do something about that, because that is the one thing that can make a difference. If we really had an intelligent classification system in which somebody could discern between legitimate national security secrets and those that just get classified out of inertia or routine, I think that could make a contribution to addressing the problem that people who talk about it say they're concerned about.
Thanks. Now, Josh, talk about drill down. You've spent a couple of years of your life not only setting up a great academic program at Medill, but working on a particular person involved in the terror and the horror, and that's the hunt for KSM. A lot of talk here this week about the agencies working together, and the cooperation's never been better, and forget about the old days. How do you view, you've dealt with a lot of these security agencies in your book. How do you view what's going on?
You mean in terms of the current status of...
Yes.
Well, I first wanted to say that I agree with Rajiv, everybody on the panel. It's great to be here with everybody here. But with what Mike said in particular about the overclassification, I was a reporter for the... I was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times for 20 years. The last 10 of those was covering national security. I started writing about terrorism and al-Qaeda before 9/11, about a year and a half before 9/11. And it was hard to get people really engaged on the topic. I think that even over time, national security reporting is a bit foreign to the public in the sense that they don't really understand how a lot of this stuff works. And so one of the reasons I co-wrote this book on the hunt for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was a way to sort of articulate and illuminate the war on terrorism and how we got to 9/11 and what happened afterwards. And it's not very well known, but the FBI and the CIA were actually looking for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed since 1993, when they identified him as the uncle of Ramzi Youssef, who was the mastermind of the first World Trade Center attacks. And so they set up a team, and they were looking for him. They traveled to about 40 countries. But as we found in the reporting of the book, the FBI and the CIA back then were not doing very well in terms of working together. A lot of those problems continued and even were exacerbated after 9/11, because all of a sudden, the FBI and the CIA really flooded the zone. They both sent more and more people to Pakistan and places like that. And when they all showed up and started working on the front lines, I think that there was a lot of friction there, a lot of tension. The FBI essentially, at least back then, was designed as an agency that looked backwards, that found, was trying to find information and evidence to solve crimes and prosecute people for things that had already happened. The CIA was trying to look forward to figure out what was going to happen next. And the FBI, in the process after 9/11, tried to retool itself into an intelligence gathering agency as well, but that created even more friction. And I think that some of those problems remain today. I think that there's probably some people in the audience that would beg to differ with me, but I think especially if you get out to the front lines, if you go to Pakistan and you go to the station in Islamabad or the embassy, you will find that there is still some friction there between the agencies. Now you have defense intelligence people still adding to the mix. So I think that we still have a ways to go in terms of dealing with some of the problems we had. But I do want to get back, and I don't have to do it now, but to the relationship between the media and these agencies. And I think that these guys will agree with me that it's all based on trust. You can't just come into Washington. I teach students now, and they can't just come into Washington and start calling people and getting information. If people start giving you really good national security information and they don't know you, you should be very, very wary of why they're doing it. And basically, I think that the good national security reporters have developed a reputation over time of being trustworthy and good and trying to get the story right. And that doesn't mean that they're there to just take what you give them and just help you fulfill your agenda. I think that people really appreciate it when reporters reporters take the time to get it right. I mean, I'll call people back and go through with what I'm going to quote them as saying before the story runs, certainly before the book came out. And I think people really appreciate that. And if you don't do that kind of stuff, if you're not careful, if you burn people, or if you even disclose sources and methods or operational details, you will find it very hard to get any more information in the future. And I think that that's a kind of important self-regulating process. I think that the reporters that do that kind of stuff don't last very long.
Paula, I know you wanted to make
So
a
I'm to
comment.
make two quick counterpoints. One to Michael, in that I don't think it's fair to say the government's not trying to declassify information or share more. It's true that we overclassify, and I've had that experience sitting in the FBI and a Joint Terrorism Task Force. But over the last 10 years, there's been a huge evolution in the Intelligence Reform Act. We talked about that a little bit, and efforts to share with our allies, because we can't do it all alone. The Five Eyes efforts, and if you've been at a NATO headquarters, you've seen some of these efforts to downgrade information so it is exchangeable. So I think we just don't see as a public the efforts that are going on in the government to share some of this information. And second, with the stovepiping, I think it's along a similar line, Josh. When I was in the FBI in 2002, 2003 on a Joint Terrorism Task Force, we all had different systems. There was not a culture of sharing. But over these 10 years, I don't know anything different anymore, sharing with my agency counterparts and so forth. So I hope that that's reflected in the future.
Two things about Paula. She mentioned to me in her book that she had to have certain elements of it kind of reviewed, and sometimes they'd say, well, this is classified, and then on her own she'd go and start Googling it. It turned out the stuff had been reported all before. So that's one thing. Second thing, yesterday you sent us the top 5 military, was it the leaks?
National security leaks of the last year.
Well, there's so much security there, I couldn't even get it open.
I couldn't open. Well, no, that's a good point. I couldn't open the email either, but I Googled it and I found it. I mean, you can.
Rajiv, interesting. You also, in addition to the government, you dealt with a lot of government contractors, especially in your last book, as far as trying to find out what's really going on here. I take it they were some very influential sources. What's the difference, nuance-wise, in approaching somebody who doesn't work directly for the government and trying to tell the story of what's going on overseas?
There might be this perception that, okay, now they're in the private sector, they'd be more chatty. The fact of the matter is a lot of the individuals who have left government still retain their clearances, still are concerned about the disclosure of sensitive information. So in some ways, it doesn't make it easier to get sensitive information from them. In many cases, as we know very well, it's a revolving door, so people who are out in the contracting world come back in. I want to just go back and build upon what we were talking about at least our perception here of the responsibility in handling information. And I totally understand that this is a subject that is there are multiple points of view out here on. Regardless of whether you believe that some of these the stories that we all, I think have come to define some of our understanding of actions taken in the national security space, be it black site prisons or enhanced interrogation techniques or warrantless wiretapping, and the list goes on. And whether you define them as leaks, you define them as revelatory, groundbreaking journalism in the public interest, or both, or somewhere in between. There is this perception out there, and I hope I'm not sort of whacking at a straw man here, that news organizations can be very cavalier about how they print this stuff. And I've spent some years as an editor at the Washington Post, and without getting into specifics, I can attest that in cases where we're talking about the most sensitive of stories, these are never things that the reporter comes to the editor with with the notes in the notebook at 5 o'clock, bangs it out, and it's in the next day's newspaper. It's the product of months and months of work in many cases, and then a lengthy process of not just editing, but high-level engagement between senior editors and senior officials at the government, between the executive editor of the Washington Post or the New York Times and the National Security Advisor, the CIA director, the FBI director. These are conversations that occur, and many of you know about these sorts of discussions. And so it's again, once they're published, yes, there's a diversity of opinion whether that story should have been published or not, but it's not for a lack of at least those news organizations in a serious way engaging with, listening to all of the counter arguments and then thoughtfully trying to evaluate it. It's not stuff that's simply done on the fly without a meaningful examination and discussion of what are the costs and benefits of the publication of such material.
Josh, you want to follow up on that?
Well, I mean, one thing that I would add to that, and is, I mean, I think that there, as Clark described, and there's some serious, hard-bitten veteran beat reporters that cover this stuff, and that's like what Rajiv says. That's what they do. I think Bob Woodward once said that a leak is something that your lazy colleagues or lazy competitors got when they just got something delivered to them by sources that are trying to spin them. But a scoop is something that you, as the industrious reporter, did by a lot of hard work and ingenuity. So, I mean, I think that I think for the most part, people that do these kind of stories do it because they've worked really hard. They have a lot of good sources. They triangulate information from different agencies and people at different levels of the agencies, and they try to figure out what the right story is. But I also think that the media is changing, and in my role now at this National Security Journalism Initiative, I've become sort of a student of the media. And the media, mainstream media is cratering, as everybody knows, and people are being laid off and bought out, and newspapers are shrinking. For the most part, the television media is doing less and less. In some aspects, I think, and there's notable exceptions. But I think that one thing that's kind of scary is that in its place, there's a lot of blogs now, and there's a lot of people that anybody with an iPad and a Twitter feed now can become a journalist and start writing about this. And again, with some notable exceptions, I think that now there's a lot of people out there that are just throwing stuff up on the internet that's opinion-based and not really well thought-out reporting, and they're trying to pass that off as national security journalism. So I can see why some of that stuff gets criticized, but I would urge people to differentiate between that and the kind of reporting that we're talking about.
Okay, as I said, there's red meat on the grill. I think people are in this room because they're puzzled. They give a damn about how the topic is covered. So I'd like to open the floor up for questions. Please identify yourself and either ask a particular member of the panel at whole. The gentleman.
Hi, I'm Tom Korologis. Preface it by saying I was a Columbia University journalism graduate, class of 58. With that question, my question is, there's a flap going on in the last 2 or 3 days, Rajiv, in Washington, over a source clearing a story before it's run. And the corollary is you go back to a source and say, here is your quote, would you like to correct it or amend it? How do we reconcile that in today's journalism?
Mike, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, except I think it was addressed to Rajiv.
I'll add in. Go ahead.
Well, look, this is a process. There are no real hard and fast rules. I mean, my sort of rule of thumb is I want to work with sources. I want to make sure I get it right. I will go back to sources, I think like everybody here, on multiple occasions to make sure before publication that I'm accurately reflecting, particularly something that's sensitive. What I won't do is share the final product with the source to edit a story beforehand. I think most people would draw the line there. But I don't see anything particularly wrong with going back to somebody who you're getting information from to make sure you're getting it right.
Rajiv, I'm sorry.
I agree. Look, I don't want to play the gotcha game. I want to make sure that when I'm quoting somebody, that I'm quoting them accurately. And if I mishear something, I want to give them an opportunity to make sure that I'm understanding the substance of what's being said. And particularly when it comes to incredibly complex issues, willing to share back with the source how I'm describing it. At the same time, again, I would sort of draw the line at sort of letting somebody shape the thrust of the entire story, or sending them a draft story saying, give me your entire comments on this. But when it comes to technical matters or complicated matters, or even descriptions or material provided by a person, I'm happy to sort of circle back with them. It's becoming increasingly in vogue, though, these days for sources to say, or officials to say, look, we'll have this discussion and then we'll clear a quote with you later. which is always a little annoying because inevitably what they want to do is massage it to a point where the quote is very different from what they originally said. And then you're left with this ethical dilemma because, when if I'm interviewing you, Tom, and you say that, the guys on the committee are a bunch of windbags, and this is in our sort of discussion, our background discussion, and then I say, okay, Tom, I want to come back to you. I really like that quote, and you say, well, actually, it's the guys in the committee are august gentlemen. Then it's that puts me in a very awkward position, and more often than not, or I will say, in almost every case, I will just not use it because it's clear to me that what you want to put on the record in that case, I'm not suggesting you've ever done this, though, is not in keeping with what I believe you really feel about this, which came out from prior discussion.
Josh, you also have to instruct students or give them advice.
Well, I mean, and I think one of the things that's happening in Washington now, and I think all of us are aghast at how the Obama administration is much more controlling of the media and willing to go after the media for leaks and so forth, and really trying to shape the message than even the Bush administration was. But I think one of the things they're doing in terms of clearing quotes is not just manipulating the quote themselves, it's clearing it with their agency. So what will happen is somebody will say, well, I need to get that quote cleared by my higher ups, and that just never will fly. I mean, I won't allow people to do that. But like Mike said, and I said earlier, this is sort of a relationship-based kind of reporting, and so of course I will go back to people. In writing the book, I went back to people dozens of times. I actually went to the CIA and said, these are the people that I'm going to be naming, by name. These are the people that are still undercover. I want to make sure that I've got this right. And there was a lot of give and take there. There was a and I talked to my students about this too. I mean, that you have to get information from different levels of government. You don't just rely on senior officials who might have an agenda. Be very careful of whistleblowers, things like that. But I mean, there was a technique that they used to find Abu Zubaydah way back in 2002 called the magic box, and they would drive around in Pakistan and try to triangulate phone calls and get information. Even though I think that might have been reported one place, it had actually still been classified, so I didn't use it in the book. But literally days before we were about to hit the button and publish, they indicted a guy named John Kiriakou, who was a CIA case officer, former case officer, and in the indictment they mentioned the technique by name because he had discussed it. So that gave me the opportunity to pop it in the book. But before that, I was very careful about not doing it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Paula.
Just one counterpoint. I wanted to understand. You said you didn't really agree with a military official, for example, or agency official having to get a statement cleared through their organization. I mean, they're not representing themselves when they give you a quote if you're using their name. So I see that as a totally legitimate requirement on their part.
Well, it depends on the context. But if I'm interviewing somebody, if I'm sitting down, I guess we disagree about that. If I'm sitting down with somebody and they're a spokesperson or even just a representative of the agency, and we're talking, we have an hour and a half conversation, and then I have to I tell them what I'm going to be using, and they have to clear that quote with their agency. I just think that is not a good. That's something I'm not willing to. I don't know about what you guys think about that, but I'm very reluctant to do that.
Here's a wonderful real world example. You go out as an embedded reporter down to a district in Afghanistan, a battalion level, where you've got a battalion command team and their associated infantry companies. You've got a district stabilization team comprised of a U.S. State Department rep, an AID rep, and perhaps some other U.S. government civilians. And here you're embedded reporter with full credentials. Come there. I can go and I can talk to that battalion commander. I can talk to officers, NCOs, enlisted personnel on the staff, almost entirely on the record. There are no restrictions. There's actually no public affairs officer that's breathing down my neck down at the battalion level. The military is willing to engage. If the deployed military out in the field in a place like Afghanistan and earlier in Iraq, willing to engage directly on the record with reporters. Certainly there were things they wouldn't talk about on the record, and certainly the candor depended on the level of trust the journalists built up with the military. But there was a default position, we will do on-the-record engagement. You walk over on that base to the district stabilization team, you try to talk to the State Department rep, you try to talk to the USAID rep, they will say, I can talk to you on background if we want to to have anything more, I need to clear it up with the embassy, and any quotes that you want to use on the record get sent all the way up to Kabul. Sometimes they get sent back to Washington. There's vetting, there's massaging, and if you're trying to turn something around quickly, inevitably you wind up often with no on-the-record comment from those civilians because it has to go all the way through bureaucracy. And so there's a real difference in the way various organs of our government are willing to engage with the media. And I say this specifically just with sort of embedded journalism in the war zones.
And we'll get in more of that later. Another question? Yes, sir.
I am Doug Feith of the Hudson Institute. You talk about training journalists, and how do you train them to be sensitive to a point that Josh alluded to, that in very many cases, journalists are talked to and provided with information not because they're respected and reliable, but because they're useful.
I'm shocked.
And journalists work very hard at making themselves useful by attacking people who don't talk to them, by protecting and rewarding people who do talk to them. And I think it's an extremely important subject, and I'd be interested in how you think it through. I mean, there are many cases also where skillful people in the national security field know that they can give a journalist a story that is useful to the official, attacking a bureaucratic rival. And they give a false story. So it's not technically a leak. It purports to be a leak. It's an account of a meeting, for example, where they say something happened that never happened. When the journalist then goes to the target, as it were, of the story, the only way the target of the story could contradict the story is by revealing classified information. And that's a real conundrum. And
I just a particular example of that?
No, I'm not sure.
Would you like to?
It's my life. Anyway, it's an interesting. I just think it's an interesting question. Do you distinguish? I mean, for example, things that get called leaks are often not leaks; they're lies. And can you train people to understand this phenomenon, to highlight the phenomenon of how people use and abuse journalists? And they do it in the secure knowledge that by talking about classified information, they can make things up and basically put other people in a position where they can't answer without violating their trust.
Well, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that I didn't have to deal with too many people like that, but I don't know. Part of it is that I have been covering this stuff for so long that people that I knew when they were frontline field agents are now at high levels and things like that. But the one thing that I always tell students is one of my favorite quotes from B.B. King, which is, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And that sort of resonates with them, even though they don't know who B.B. King is. I tell them that he's an old guy that used to play something called the blues, which they also don't know what it is. But I'm not really sure how to answer that, but I think that the most important thing you can do in any kind of journalism, but especially national security reporting, is to trust but verify, get a lot of different sources. I mean, I can't remember any cases where I would just put something in the paper or in a book that's based on one source. And what I try to do is go to different agencies, and again, go to different levels of the agency. Get a senior official, get some mid-level person, go to somebody on the Hill. I mean, you're always trying to triangulate information, and that's what I tell the students.
And just to add, if it's really a lie, to use your term, the story's not going to hold up. Right. Other people are going to try to check out and verify the story, and are going to go to multiple sources. And if if the story doesn't hold up, then it's going to sink and disappear. Yeah. So I think the really important stories that have been the subject of leaks that I can think of that have produced controversy, by and large, have held up in substantial ways. So I don't really see that as a big problem. I'm sure there are particulars about accounts of meetings where that kind of dispute is going to regularly come up.
And like Wolf Blitzer the other night, he tried to get Admiral McCraven to say, well, can you give us an example? Mission scuttled, lives lost. When we're having these types of discussions, I think it just puts it into context, its perspective. So to just do it philosophically is tough.
Well, can I just add one thing really quickly? I think that there's sort of this jaundiced perception of the media that we just sit there and wait for our phone to ring. I mean, that these days there are still so many good reporters left covering this stuff, and there's so much open source information out there that it's not like you have some, like the Pentagon Papers fall on your desk. I think most good stories are incremental in the sense that they take something and push it forward, or they have a different angle on something. So what I tell the students to do, to get back to that, is go to a lot of congressional hearings, just try to go out there and get the information. Don't wait for people to come to you. Go to them and ask for information. Try to get as many background briefings as you can. And when I do have sources that seem to want to tell me something, I end up, usually the better story that I get is not something that they came to talk to me about. It's something that I asked them about while I was talking to them. So I don't know if that helps, but...
Bart
Gelman. This is a very polite audience. And I would venture to say that nobody in this room is buying the idea, Mike, Josh, that you're super careful and you know when you're crossing a line and you're not going to endanger security. And I say this as one of the people who will be lined up against the wall with you. And the question that might come to mind is who elected you to make decisions about what does or doesn't threaten security? But if you stipulate that there's more than one interest here, that there's self-defense, but there's also self-government, and that the president, for example, has absolutely no inhibition, and all the tens of thousands of people he designates have no inhibition or limit on what they can classify, and that I think a lot of people in this room might recognize that one of the highest levels of classification, as many of you have told me, is top secret / embarrassing. Then there's a balance to be struck, and I wonder what you would think of this model that asking you how dare you set the line is almost like asking the gas station on the corner how dare you set the price of gas, which is a pretty vital commodity in our economy. That there are market forces at work. There's a competition in which people like you are trying to find things out. People in the government who want to control information for either good or bad reasons, trying to prevent you. And then toward the end, there's a next layer of cooperation in which, as you've described, you talk through what are the competing interests, and often, but not always, come to some meeting of the minds. I mean, is a marketplace a good model for what happens here?
Well, do you want me to answer that? Well, hopefully we can all answer it. I'll answer briefly. I mean, when I was at the LA Times, I was lucky to have various layers of people that were involved in the discussions. I remember we were writing about the SWIFT controversy, the jacking into the banking system to get financial data from the about terrorists. And I remember the New York Times, and we were sort of neck and neck in trying to break a story about this. And we had meetings that went all the way up to the top of the paper. We were sitting in the Treasury Stuart Levy's office. I know Stuart's not here, but just hearing their third pitch about why we should not run the story, and we were very willing to listen to them. We were in there for like an hour and a half, and for me, I was actually glad that even though we had done the best story we could, that ultimately that I was not the one who was making the decision. My editors were. And while we're in the meeting, one of the guys from this Treasury Department starts passing around a BlackBerry to everybody else there, and it was a copy of the New York Times story that they posted while we were in the meeting. So we didn't have to decide that. But I don't think it's just up to the reporter. I think that there's more people there, even when you're writing a book.
I was going to say, I think the marketplace metaphor is could be useful in a lot of ways. This has been framed often as leaks to the news media that compromise national security or compromise security of operations. But there are lots of things that compromise security of operations. Read in spycraft, any operation that is underway, the agents and officers involved are constantly thinking, trying to figure out ways that might compromise their operation. A foreign intelligence agency might find out about it. There might be somebody at a local hotel might be on somebody's payroll. There are lots of things. And compromises in security take place all the time that compromise operations. It's sort of the cost of doing business, and I think that actually is a good sort of useful way of looking at it. Leaks to the news media are a cost of doing business in government. It's what's going to happen. It is often could come from rivals in other government agencies or from Capitol Hill or from wherever, but it's going to happen. It's been happening for hundreds of years. It's going to continue to happen, and sort of get used to it. You accept that as a cost of doing business in undertaking operations in the field. It's the cost of doing business in government. And
we've got a lot of people that want to ask questions. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here.
Dina Temple-Raston, National Public Radio. And I was going to get to Mr. Fife's question about, say, people using the media and actually trying to have a vendetta against somebody in particular. There are ways to confirm and not confirm things without revealing classified information. And one of the classic journalist formulations is, I have this story. Is this a story you think I should run with? You wouldn't be revealing classified information if you said, for example, if the meeting was misrepresented, I wouldn't. And if we got that from you, I can tell you that we would stop dead in our tracks and start going other places to find out what the real representation of that meeting or that was. And I know that someone at NPR would certainly do that, regardless of who the target of whatever it was. So I think in particular, we're also very, very concerned when you have one person attacking another person. We never take that on face value.
I can guarantee you the one thing reporters don't like is to feel like they're being manipulated.
Okay. We got time for 3 questions. The gentleman here, and back, the woman back there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Guy Swan from the Association of the U.S. Army, recently retired. I wanted to follow up on Rajiv's point about embedded reporting. And I certainly have seen during the course of my career a growing sophistication in the armed forces with the presence of the media as part of the environment. Many commanders are comfortable now with embedded media. What is your perception in the entire group? What is the future of embedded reporting? We've seen this. Some of it is cost-driven by your organizations. The value is often balanced against other sources. But what's the future of embedded reporting?
Let's let Rajiv and Paula handle that.
Yes.
So long as we have substantial numbers of deployed forces, I think you will continue to see a healthy interest in embedded reporting. It's not the only way to get a story. We have to be very clear about that. You only see part of the story, but understanding the experience of the deployed men and women out there, what they're doing, that's an important story for the audience back home. And it's important to see the connection between high-level policy made up in Washington and how it is executed down there on the ground. So, there was a lot of hand-wringing about embedding early on in the Iraq War. I think we've gotten over a lot of it, in large part because both the issues of trust and how we both operate together have been now worked through over a period of years, and there is a better understanding that embedding gets you to some part of the story, but not all of it, but a challenge is, for instance, in places like I operate in southern Afghanistan, there are places that you just can't drive around on your own, so it becomes much tougher. Just like in the early days of the Iraq War, you had to be with the troops, or you were kind of unilateral in Baghdad. But, I see a healthy future for it so long as we got troops out there.
Paula, you were in embed.
Yes, and I was going to say, I think the culture has really shifted in the military. When I went through Command and General Staff College, we were really taught to embrace the press and be the first with truth and don't put lipstick on a pig. If something went wrong, you should get those facts out there instead of trying to hide it. And I think my experience with the troops is that they love having embedded journalists. They want to tell their story. They want the successful stories to get out, and usually the news is just negative. So I think it's embraced in the military, as you know. And from the journalist or author point of view, you can't get the story in the granular detail like these gentlemen have unless you go there and you live it a little bit. So
okay. Clark said we got an extra 5 minutes, so we have 2 questions, and then behind you. Go ahead.
My name is Arlie Sherman, and I would like your comments on General McChrystal's treatment by the media.
Who wants to take General McChrystal?
Go for it.
All right.
I'll chime in.
Well, I had to follow Michael Hastings in Afghanistan, and so that was interesting, but didn't face the same culture. This willingness to embrace the media, almost too much of trust, and I think McChrystal obviously has expressed regret over what happened, and I think though that probably was a culture amongst his team to share information that probably shouldn't have been shared with reporters. It's very difficult.
I think both sides realize access is a two-way street.
Yeah.
Well, look, I spent a lot of time with McChrystal and his staff, and never once did I hear those things. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that they weren't said in the presence of Michael Hastings, but I think one has to understand maybe that folks on his team were mindful of the fact when Dexter Filkins from the Times was there, or I was there from the Post, that you weren't going to say that stuff, but maybe they thought, okay, it's Rolling Stone, who cares? And in our internet-connected age, well, if it's in Rolling Stone, people still care, and so perhaps the news organization matters less when it comes to saying things you shouldn't say. I think there was also a basic failure of the public affairs officer there in failing to look. A lot of times we will work on profiles with people where you want to spend time inside that bubble, and you're willing to make a commitment that some things are off the record or they're at least on deep background. So you're brought into discussions that you might not otherwise get into. But to be able to see a subject in action, to be able to get context and color, as we call it in the business. But almost always there are clear ground rules that are set. This is what you can and can't do. And by all accounts, in the case of the Rolling Stone profile, those ground rules weren't clearly set. And so this may not be all that different from the general's pilot failing to appropriately set the flaps on takeoff. Plane takes off and crashes and kills everyone on board.
The one thing I'll add briefly to that is Hastings came to the Medill, to our National Security Journalism Initiative, to talk about that story, and he got almost eaten alive by other reporters. And I'm not saying that he's right or they're right, but I know that there's a lot of fundamental disagreements in the media over how to handle a story like that. Whether the one thing that I do remember about that is I don't think McChrystal ever said that he didn't say any of those things or that they didn't happen, but I think a lot of it was whether or not the reporter and had betrayed some confidences about that and so forth. But there's a lot of difference in the media about how that was handled.
And if you go back and you read Hastings' book, The Runaway General, I'm not sitting up here recommending it, but if you do, and you look at the original Rolling Stone piece, quotes that were sort of not attributed by name in the piece are attributed by name in many cases in the book, and you'll see that at least my takeaway from it, and different people may have different readings of this, was that it wasn't a huge number of people on McChrystal's staff that said some of the more incendiary things. And so, with the benefit of that book, you start to be able to put some of it in context. I'm not trying to condone it and obviously know what McChrystal has said and not said in the wake of this, but it's certainly a more nuanced picture that comes through from the book as opposed to the initial magazine article.
Okay, I'm sorry, we could go all day, but final question.
Hi, this has been fantastic. Evelyn Farkas, U.S. European Command. Prior to being at the U.S. European Command, I spent about a decade in the legislative branch. And in the legislative branch, we have a different relationship with the media. I'm saying we, although I'm not in the legislative branch anymore, but the legislative branch relies on the media for access to information that sometimes we don't have access to. So, for example, this triangulation might result in my case, oftentimes phone calls from people like Dana Priest and Eric Schmidt asking me, is this true that the soft forces are going to do this, that, or the other thing? And it was the first time I'd heard of this, so then it allowed me to call them up to the Hill to talk to us about it. But I wonder, so I'm interested in your perspectives, if you could just talk about the differences in dealing with the executive branch versus the legislative branch.
Mike, can you take that one?
Well, that's actually an interesting scenario because it probably happens quite a bit. And I think that in almost every big story, there's a lot of triangulation, to use your word there, where you get a bit from one place and then you run it by another place. And the more that people think you know, the more they're likely to tell you. So there's a bit of a game that's played there where you always want to suggest to your source you know as much as you would like them to think you know, which is often more than you actually do know. But those of us who are experienced at this can infer a lot. And when we get a bit of piece of information, if we've been doing it for a while, we can sort of figure out where we think the other pieces of the puzzle are. That is a very useful technique in getting a lot of information from different places. And a lot of times, in just the scenario you use, you'll ask a source who will be intrigued by something that they've heard from you, and they will want to go out and try to help you because they want to know, is that really the case? Their bosses will want to know if that's really the case. And that's oftentimes the way the process works.
All right, I began opening this talking about this healthy tension that should exist. You've got a great panel up here, but there are Kim, Dina, Barton, Dana, Eric. There are many journalists up here. Have the same kind of discussions with them. We're here to learn from you, but hopefully it's vice versa. On behalf of Paula, Rajiv, Michael, and Josh, thank you so much for your time today.